Me now?
Yeah, all good.
Yeah, you can?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Emma, for the introduction, and I'm very glad to be here with you tonight, and good evening, everyone. And even though I'm very happy to be part of this annual conference, I need to start with a disclaimer, meaning that I'm a social scientist, I'm not an engineer. So to be honest with you, I cannot draw a straight line with the ruler. Therefore, all I can try is to engineer a utopia. And this is precisely what I'll try to do today by discussing the theory of degrowth. So the reason why I think that degrowth is relevant to the debate on communities' resilience is because our present obsession with economic growth makes us not resilient to changing conditions around us. The ideology of growthism peddles the illusion that there is only a one-way future, one in which material production can be expanded at will, and that this is essential for human flourishing. And the reason why our obsession with growth makes us not resilient to changing conditions is evident in the case of the pandemic. For instance, we know that putting people back to work in offices and factories is dangerous, as they may get infected with COVID. And yet, we cannot come to terms with the fact that production and therefore consumption needs to be downscaled in the present conjuncture, meaning we all need to work and consume less to be able to ensure that workers don't need to do non-essential, let's say, work. And of course, I believe that the same can be said about the ecological crisis, of which the pandemic, let's not forget, is a manifestation. But we are so stuck in our ways that we deny reality. But change is difficult, and yet change we must, because there is no miraculous technofix to the climate crisis, no vaccine around the corner for the global ecological breakdown. The ecological crisis is the result of the way in which we have transformed the biosphere to serve the narrow logic of economic efficiency. And it's precisely at the narrow logic of economicism that degrowth takes aim. Let's say that at its core, degrowth postulates that it's possible to decrease the production and consumption of goods and services at the aggregate level, whether within a society or at the global level, while at the same time increasing social well-being and averting the global ecological breakdown. The central proposition of degrowth is that the correlation between GDP and human welfare breaks down after a certain point. And most rich industrialized countries hit this point around the end of the 70s and have seen no net progress in their welfare indicators in the following half a century. In fact, the assumption that growth is good for well-being is contested by researchers. In most Western countries, the number of people reporting that they are very happy has remained more or less the same despite continuous growth over the past half a century. That growth, the fact that growth does not have a long-term impact on personal well-being, makes sense after all. If you think about it, in a class system, one's social status depends on position. And growth increases average, not relative incomes and therefore positions. To put it in simple terms, having today what a richer person had yesterday may give us temporary satisfaction, but tomorrow you still have less than others. So basically, your position in society has remained unchanged. And therefore, frustration returns as your preferences adapt to what you already have. And as you make comparisons with others and still find yourself wanting. That's how the consumerist treadmill works. This being said, the theory of degrowth does not only argue that the correlation between GDP and human welfare breaks down after a certain point, but also that more GDP growth begins to have a negative impact after a certain point. Indeed, the continued pursuit of growth drives environmental destruction. And to discuss this claim, I'll start by giving you a figure that sets the scene for the kind of conversation I believe we should be having. The figure is, if the global economy continues to grow at the usual rate of 2–3% per year, then in the next 30 years, we will consume as much energy and materials as we did cumulatively over the past 10,000 years. So in the next 30 years, we'll use as much energy and materials as we did in the previous 10,000 years. I think this should be quite striking figures for engineers. The key thing to grasp here is that the increasing material and energy use tracks more or less exactly the rise of global GDP. The two have grown together in lockstep. Every additional unit of GDP growth means an additional unit of material extraction. And since the year 2000, the growth of material use has outpaced the growth of GDP. So instead of gradually dematerializing, the global economy has been rematerializing. And because GDP growth is driving energy demand up at such a rapid pace, renewable energy is not replacing fossil fuels, but it is being added on top of them. So instead of speaking of an energy transition, we should be speaking of an energy addition. And actually, that's not a first in the sense that historically, every new source of energy has been added on top of existing ones. For instance, today, the world is producing 8 billion more megawatt hours of clean energy each year than in the year 2000. That's a lot. Actually, enough to power the whole of Russia, just to give you a figure. But over exactly the same period of time, economic growth has caused energy demand to increase by 48 billion megawatt hours. So 8 billion megawatt hours more of renewable energy production since the year 2000, but we use 48 billion megawatt hours more than we did on that reference year. So in other words, all the clean energy we have been rolling out covers only a small fraction of new demand. And with business as usual, the global economy is set to roughly triple in size by the mid of the century. That's 3 times more extraction and production than we are presently doing, and all of which would suck up nearly 3 times as much end-use energy. So it is already very difficult for us to decarbonize the existing global economy, but it will be simply impossible to do it 3 times over. It would require that we decarbonize the global economy at a rate of about 12% per year. And that's more than 5 times faster than the historical rate of decarbonization, and 3 times faster than what most scientists project as achievable, even under very optimistic conditions. Some recent studies have put forward an incredible amount of empirical evidence proving that the decoupling of economic growth from environmental impacts anywhere near the scale needed to deal with the ecological crisis is not happening. But even more problematic than that is that these studies show that such decoupling appears unlikely to happen even in the future. Another point I wanted to make is that the vast majority of energy is consumed not by households, but by industry. So the best way to reduce energy use is to focus not on energy itself, but actually on the material throughput of our economy. It may seem counterintuitive that the solution to the problem of emissions has to do with materials. However, What's so brilliant about downscaling material use is that it helps to solve not only the climate crisis, but also to solve all the other dimensions of the ecological breakdown, ranging from deforestation to biodiversity collapse to water use, because all of these crises are caused by excess material extraction and waste. So we may say that by focusing on the material throughput to decrease the use of energy and therefore the amount of emissions we pump into the atmosphere is an ecologically coherent solution to the variety of crises at hand. At this point, many of you may be wondering how we can ensure that we provide for the essentials of life in the context of an economy that doesn't grow. That's usually what scares people about the growth in the first place. Well, the truth is that the interventions that matter when it comes to improving human welfare do not require high levels of GDP. Proof of that is that the European Union as a whole has 36% less income than the United States. And yet, the European Union beats the US not only on life expectancy, but on virtually every indicator of human welfare. But even more strikingly, there are some countries that are usually defined as developing countries that manage to achieve high levels of human welfare with low GDP per capita than the European Union and the United States. For example, Costa Rica in Central America, a country that surpasses the United States on many welfare indicators with a GDP per capita that is only 1/7 the one of the US. You may wonder, what explains such remarkable results? Well, the truth is that when it comes to delivering long, healthy, flourishing lives for all citizens, what counts is investing in high-quality universal public services, which are significantly more cost-efficient to run than their private counterparts. And incidentally, they also entail a smaller ecological footprint to satisfy people's needs than the private alternatives. However, what's been happening since the 1980s is that an endless wave of privatization on education, healthcare, transportation, housing, and even social security has been unleashed on the world. So social goods are everywhere under attack. And I argue that this is a purposeful strategy. The idea is that by making public goods artificially scarce, people will have no choice but to purchase private alternatives, meaning that people end up buying what they used to be able to access for free as public services. And what happens when you enclose a good that used to be accessed for free? Well, GDP grows. GDP grows because money changes hands. But the line of reasoning that, let's say, degrowth theory is premised upon is that if scarcity, so this artificial scarcity that I've been talking about in the context of privatization, has been created for the sake of growth, well, then by reversing this artificial scarcity, we can render growth unnecessary. By de-enclosing and expanding the commons, we can enable people to access the goods that they need to live well without needing high levels of income and therefore additional growth. In this way, people would be able to work less without any loss to their quality of life, and at the same time producing less unnecessary stuff and generating less pressure on the biosphere. It's true that the economy would be smaller in terms of GDP, and yet it would be more abundant in terms of human welfare. So in a nutshell, we could say that degrowth calls for abundance in order to render growth unnecessary. I hope that by this point I've convinced you about the ecological desirability and social desirability of degrowth. But I'm sure that many of you are wondering, what about the global south? This is fine for rich countries that don't need more growth, but what about the global south? Well, indeed, one of the most common criticisms to degrowth is that it ignores the need of increasing incomes in the global south. And the question is usually articulated in these terms. So either we stop the growth machine for the sake of ecological stability, therefore sacrificing the poor, or we improve the lives of the poor, but sacrifice the ecology of which we depend. It seems like it's a double bind. But fortunately, there is a way out. The key is to recognize that we don't live in a poor world that needs more growth. On the contrary, we live in a world that's already incredibly rich. And at the global level, we have more than enough to end global poverty many times over. The problem is that it's all captured at the very top. So when we normally think of the global poor, we tend to imagine people who are somehow cut off from the world economy, people who live in backwaters untouched by globalization, unconnected from the lives of people who live in Europe, North America. But this image gives us completely the wrong impression. The truth is that the poorest 60% of humanity are deeply integrated into the circuits of global capital. They work in the sweatshops of multinational companies. They spend their lives mining the rare earth minerals that we depend on for our smartphones, laptops. They harvest the tea leaves and coffee beans that most people consume every day. And the fossil fuels, the minerals we need are extracting from the land where these people live. So all told, these people contribute the vast majority of the labor and resources that go into the global economy. And yet, in return, they receive only 5% of total global income. By contrast, the vast majority of new income from global growth goes to the world's richest. So just bear in mind the fact that the richest 1% alone capture $19 trillion in income every year, which represents nearly a quarter of global GDP. So the top 1% captures 25% of global GDP growth. And the rich lay claim to a truly staggering share of the income that the global economy generates. Since the year 1980, 28%, so almost a third of new income from global GDP growth has gone to the richest 1%. So in other words, nearly 1/3 of all the labor we have rendered, all the resources we have extracted, all the CO2 we have emitted over the past half century has gone to make rich people even richer. So it makes little sense to call for more growth in order to improve the lives of the poor when the vast majority of it just goes straight to the already rich. And a recent study found that given the existing rate at which incomes from growth trickles down to the poor, it will take 200 years to bring everyone in the world above the poverty line. And to get there, we will need to grow the global GDP to 170 times its present size. That's also 170 times more extraction and production and consumption that we are already doing. And I think that the scale of this is horrifying to contemplate. As a strategy for ending poverty, this approach is terribly inefficient and ecologically insane. I think well out of step with any understanding of planetary boundaries. So there is simply no way this can be achieved without triggering a truly catastrophic climate change, which would of course obliterate any potential gains from poverty reduction. So what I propose is that we don't need aggregate global growth to end poverty. What we need to bring everyone in the world above the poverty line of $7.40 per day would require about $6 trillion. So let's do some maths. That's a significant sum on the face of it. But notice that it's only 1/3 of the annual income of the richest 1%. So by shifting $6 trillion of excess income from the richest 1% to the poorest 4 billion people in the world, we could end poverty in a stroke and still leave the rich with an annual income of about $200,000 per year. which is more than anyone could ever reasonably need. So when you think about the fact that we don't live in a poor world, but we live in an unjust world, well, then new opportunities arise. When we think about the growth conundrum that I talked about before from this angle, so the supposed double bind between ending mass poverty and restoring ecological stability melts away and reveals a much easier choice between living in a more equitable society on the one hand and risking ecological catastrophe on the other, just to maintain the current levels of inequality. And I believe that most people would have little difficulty in choosing between the two. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks so much, Riccardo. I think it's a compelling presentation and hopefully one that's got us all thinking. I'll put the floor out to you guys as well for any questions that you have that you'd like to pose to Riccardo. But I suppose maybe I will have two in there myself to maybe start us off. The first one, in terms of obviously the richest 1% that you talk about in terms of the wealth that they capture, Riccardo, how do you think we should approach trying to we'll use the word extract or take back? How would we access income or be able to engage in a process of redistribution and considering current global systems of tax evasion and sort of financial flows? How do you best approach consider we should approach that or tackle it, should I say?
Well, I think this is a tough battle. It's an uphill battle also because we know how much the wealth they capture. I think key institutions in our democracies, and therefore it makes it all the more difficult to, how can I say, bring into the public debate these common sense arguments. So I concluded my keynote speech by saying that I believe that if most people were presented with this choice, they would have a little doubt about which one to choose. The problem is that this question is not really posed. And this is a challenge for every country, in the sense that often when we think about, let's say, wealth inequality and therefore also, let's say, ecological inequality, we often polarize in terms of the global north and the global south. But the truth is that there are extremely wealthy individuals within every country. So I think that increasingly, also in terms of climate negotiations, we need to start thinking more in terms of inequality within each society rather than common, let's say, targets for countries. I think that there are some researchers that have put forward some very compelling arguments about the fact that the super wealthy in countries where, let's say, the average per capita income is still low should stop hiding behind their poors, meaning that this form of redistribution, both in wealth terms and also in ecological footprint terms, needs to be done within every country. And I don't have a silver bullet for that, because as you correctly said, the global economy offers many loopholes to hide wealth and simply siphoning out of the places where actually that wealth is accrued. So I think that we somehow already know what the measures should be. So wealth taxes, shutting down tax havens. The point is that now we need to rally, let's say, the political support for doing that. So even though I'm a researcher, I say enough with research, enough with coming up with ideas. We know what the good ideas are. We just need to put them into practice now.
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah. Thanks very much, Riccardo. We have a question here from Liam. What is your opinion of the Sustainable Development Goals, and what role do they play in strategy for degrowth, or do they play a role?
Right. Thanks. Well, actually, the last time I was invited by Engineers Without Borders to participate to one of their events. We discussed the Sustainable Development Goals. So. I think it's a recurring question, because it's something that is very prominent, let's say, now in the public debate. I think the Sustainable Development Goals are surely, can I say, step in the right direction. I think the fact of having these multi-dimensional indicators is a good sign. So moving away from the fetishism with GDP, so with this single figure that captures, let's say, all forms of values and what makes life worth living and so on. So definitely it allows us for a more nuanced approach to to economic and environmental policy making. Yet, I think that there is a bug in it, which is, of course, still the relevance being placed on economic growth. So, of course, if the assumptions, the hypothesis that I put forward tonight in my keynote speech is correct, then, well, it's very difficult to achieve all those let's say, praiseworthy sustainable development goals while also pursuing economic growth. And I think that the how can I say, let's say, the vacuity in a way of some of this exercise is exemplified by the Sustainable Development Goals Index. So basically a ranking of countries of which one performs the best. Well, so basically you see that at the top are, for example, Scandinavian countries because they achieve such high levels of human welfare and so on. But then if you look at the average per capita ecological footprint of these countries, you realize that it's, of course, they represent no blueprint for the entirety of humanity. It's still very much built upon colonialism, I mean, forms of extractivism from the rest of the world. So I'll wrap up just suggesting this interesting indicator, which I think is, to my knowledge, the most comprehensive one. It's called Sustainable Development Index. You find it on the website sustainabledevelopmentindex.org, and basically it clusters together ecological welfare indicators, but then it has a threshold for income, meaning that above a certain threshold, the countries don't, let's say, get any extra points for higher levels of per capita incomes. So starts from the assumption that above a certain point, that income doesn't really translate into happiness or increases in human welfare and life expectancy, as I was saying. So I think that's an interesting indicator that should be discussed more often.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I'll just actually, maybe I'll put that or if you want to maybe put it in the chat there for the guys, Riccardo. Yeah, it's definitely a really interesting resource and well worthwhile checking out, guys, to kind of, yeah, reframing, you know, how we measure countries, and, you know, and the end rethinking how countries are awarded. And as Riccardo rightly said, that, you know, the traditional indexes, you know, countries can rise to the top even when they've, you know, ecological footprints that, you know, are, you know, massive, and that if every country in the world was operating in this way, we'd need multiple Earths to sustain it. So it kind of cuts to the chase in terms of, you know, viewing it as how we need to. So guys, I'm going to put it out to you now. I'm sure there may be some questions for Riccardo. Would anyone like to jump in there, either unmute yourself or pop it in the chat for Riccardo?
Hi, Riccardo. Not sure if I'm coming through there.
Yeah, we can hear you, Patrick. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thanks very much for a fascinating discussion. It's really nice to hear, you know, you're so passionate about this, and you're in really friendly company. Engineers and scientists are really people who, you know, like to think about big ideas and problem solving. And just listening to your analysis there, and it seems to me that there are, you know, three big strands. So you've got reducing social injustice and absolute poverty. I'd say that's one of them. It seems to be like a distribution problem within both, you know, internationally as well as within economies. So, you know, the more equitable sharing of resources. And it seems to me that in a very practical sense, when engineers are called upon, you know, to do the building of infrastructure within global and, you know, national things, you know, you've got public goods there that builds resilience and helps to strengthen, you know, civic society. It seems to me also another strand you have there, ecological restoration. So, transitioning to a green economy, maybe based on renewable energies and materials. You know, that's an area that engineers and scientists can really help out on, whether it's on solar energy, hydroelectric power, innovative materials that are recyclable. Another strand that I thought I detected there was, you know, sustainability. You know, we're talking all about the sustainable development goals, you know, transitioning the global economy to, you know, renewable, sustainable basis. Again, you know, technical innovation, which is kind of what engineers do day in, day out. That's really at the heart of that, being able to maybe innovate our way through it. So I'm just wondering, for you personally, shifting away, you know, from necessarily the degrowth narrative, which is fascinating in its own right, but more to innovating in part our way out of this and moving towards a more green economy, a more socially just economy. What are your thoughts on the best ways to engage, you know, people in different sectors of the community, decision makers, you know, political bodies and so on? I'd just be curious to hear your thoughts, and thanks very much for very fascinating analysis.
Well, thanks, Patrick. You summed up very well the core tenets of Degrowth. Well, yes, now, of course, the challenge is how do we bring, let's say, this vision into reality? And that's the toughest part. But I believe that some backcasting can be useful. So in a way, we set what our goals are, and then we move backward thinking what are the intermediate steps to get there. I think that the pandemic provided us with, not provided us, let's say, brought back to the fore of the public debate this concept of resilience, which is really the key concept, because we need to shift, let's say, mostly from this understanding of let's say, accumulation and always having something more to later, let's say, stabilize and increase the resilience, the robustness of welfare and infrastructural systems that we have already put in place, at least in many parts of the world. In others, surely there still needs to be some, of course, material and energy use expansion. So I think that this focus on resilience works very well, because it's a concept that can be applied to the built environment, ecosystems and communities. So it's a word I think that we should reclaim. And I think that there are many, let's say, many issues on which the core principles that you sketched out so well about that compose, let's say, the growth can be applied. So I think now the challenge is to bring down, let's say, these ideas, these principles, and apply them to every single issue that we are faced with.
Okay, you look up to me.
And the scale also at which we should do this is manifold, in the sense that I hear.
Elaine, we might just ask you to mute yourself there if you can. Thanks. No worries. Yeah.
I think he was making more sense than I was. But still. Yeah, so also the different scales at which we should operate. So both at the local, at the national, at the international level. So I don't have such a, there is a Greenpeace report that I authored that will be coming out in the next couple of months, where I sketch out, along with some colleagues, 7, let's say, key proposals to how to rethink work, how to rethink money, how to rethink companies, how to rethink other, let's say, aspects of our society. And that will provide with some good insights. So maybe what I'll do is share this link when it comes out later on in the year.
Thanks, Riccardo. Yeah, that would be brilliant. Look forward to reading it, certainly, and seeing your thoughts on it and from other contributors. Any other questions there, guys, that you want to ask Riccardo?
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
You speak very convincingly on how GDP and human welfare are not correlated, and if we want to optimize human welfare, we should abandon GDP as this instrumental goal. But I don't know if kind of implicit in this model is that the current power structures and decision makers have human welfare as one of their intrinsic goals. And if it's not implicit in your understanding of this, do you have thoughts on how to implement this goal in that reality?
All right, thanks, Sean. Yes, I totally agree with you. I think that there is at times a bit of a naivety around the debates on the beyond the GDP. I've been part of lots of those debates, as if, you know, GDP is these broken indicators. We never wanted this thing, but, you know, in an awkward way, we got stuck with using it. I think that GDP does exactly what it's supposed to do, meaning it calculates and it focuses on maximization of capital accumulation at the expense of all other aspects of our society. So I do not think that the problem is fixing GDP, but keeping, let's say, the institutions, the power structure, and the direction of the economy as it is now. The challenge is to ditch GDP because it's not useful. But as we do that, that will just reveal how skewed all our public policy, economic, social priorities are. So at the end of the day, I don't see this as a purely, let's say, technical or technocratic exercise in which we just need a bunch of researchers to come up with the better indicators, hand it over to a group of enlightened philosopher kings, and then they will just bring about a better society. I think that a different society, one that focuses on communities' well-being or resilience rather than profit accumulation, is one that will only be borne out by social conflict, basically by the many reclaiming priorities for themselves over the priorities of the rich. The same, of course, it can be said now in the pandemic. I think the pandemic in many respects is a very interesting experiment that is happening, which is revealing fault lines and also very perverse mechanisms in our society. Of course, we know that people would be better off if they didn't have to go to work and get infected and spread into their communities and so on and so forth. But God forbid that we shut down factories, even the non-essential. So also this, we see how much that is a political conflict. When the first COVID wave happened last spring, everybody was taken by surprise to the point where we shut down economic activities as long as with social interactions. And we started distinguishing between essential and luxury production. And that is, I think, at the core of what, let's say, rethinking production from a degrowth perspective should be about. What are the things we really need? Sure, those we need, we should keep on making them. And those that we need and we are not making them now, we should increase, let's say, the amount of time and energy, labor that we put into their production or their realization, because they're also services, not just goods, of course. But then what happened as time passed by, you might say that, you know, the system, let's say the powers that be, had enough time to reorganize themselves. And they were like, wait a second, why do we need to shut down factories that are non-essential simply because people get sick, when we could just, you know, shut them down, shut people in their homes with a curfew when they are done with their working day? I think this is outrageous. I think it's something that is not discussed about in our society, is that there's no questioning that it's fine. I get out of my house at 8 a.m. in the morning in a crammed metro to go to work, but then at 6 p.m. or 9 p.m. or 10 p.m. I need to be shut into my home because at the point, let's say my working day is done, and of course all the social reproduction I would be doing past that is non-essential. So sorry for a long winding answer, but I agree that the issue is not a purely, let's say, technical or policy, but it's in the end a political issue. It's about rethinking what makes life worth living and what we want to prioritize as a society.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sean.
Thanks very much, Riccardo. Yeah, absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head there, and in terms of the hypocrisy it's in there, and how some people's lives can be more expendable than others, in terms of the context of, oh, we have to go to work, but the risk that's there, but that's just something that has to be done. But those at the very top don't need to face those situations. So yeah, thanks very much for that. Are there any last questions, guys? I'm conscious that Riccardo will also need to leave in a couple of minutes or shortly for another engagement. So maybe any last question there quickly for Riccardo? No, if not, I might just quickly nab you for one more, Riccardo, before you go, if you have time, if you have a couple of minutes. It's just, yeah, very briefly in terms of what you mentioned there in the paper that you have, so maybe drawn on that a bit in terms of companies and how companies operate, how we could approach reorganizing and making that shift when so many companies are have a consumer-oriented approach, and to be able to be viable, need people to keep buying. In terms of a large contraction of that, I suppose what could happen with that workforce, or what that shift might mean. I know so that might be tall order for the few minutes you have there, but whatever time you have to spare.
Yeah, that's a big question, and I think that the key aspect here is ownership. I think that there are many valuable examples of companies that operate looking, let's say, beyond the narrow purpose of profit maximization. But I think that often that is driven also by different ownership structures. So I think that cooperatives are able, let's say, to reprioritize certain goals over profit because of their ownership structure, their let's say different ambition, let's say, and also rates of returns. So I think that it would be very difficult to let's say motivate private entrepreneurs and even more so private investors if we don't challenge this very concentrated ownership of firms, either because of high concentration in the stock market, so mostly speaking about, let's say, big companies, but also in smaller companies because of, let's say, a rift between ownership and workers and communities. So I think that forms of economic democracy is the most fruitful venue that we should explore, and not involving just workers, but also involving the local communities, because I think that a relocalization of economic production also would go a long way in reasserting the preeminence of a variety of socio-ecological objectives over the narrow economic ones. Because if factories are placed in communities and workers and local communities are brought into boards to discuss decisions of what to produce, how to produce, at that point, more sustainable and socially desirable decisions can be taken. So I think that the aspect of ownership and the aspect of delocalization, so relocalizing also production, is very important. And that, of course, takes aim at also global trade, because as we were saying at the beginning, borders are often used as to divide us, and in nationalistic terms to, let's say, rally people around the most retrograde ideas of identity. At the same time, I don't think that globalization per se, when it comes to economic flows, is something desirable. So we probably need also to rethink where we produce and consume more locally, and therefore be more participatory, not just in consumption, but also in production. I'll leave it at that, not just because I have to go, but also because I would probably not know what to say much more with regard to this.
Thanks.